The police arrested a black man and took him to court, but they didn't know he was a Supreme Court justice. Watch and comment. Where are you watching this video from? The summer sun hung low over the sleepy provincial town, casting long, languid shadows across its cracked pavements and time-worn storefronts. Elijah Reeves, a man accustomed to grandeur and gravity in his everyday dealings as a Supreme Court justice, found the modesty of the town refreshing. He had arrived the previous evening, leaving behind the marble halls and polished debates of the nation's capital. For once, he sought anonymity, a chance to blend into a crowd where no one whispered his name or scrutinized his every decision. His attire was deliberate, a plain white shirt, faded jeans, and well-worn sneakers. He carried no briefcase, wore no watch. He had even left his cell phone at the small roadside motel where he was staying, opting for an unencumbered stroll through the town's cobblestone streets. As he wandered through the marketplace, he allowed himself to savor the simplicity of the moment, the aroma of freshly baked bread wafting from a nearby bakery, the sound of children's laughter echoing from a playground, the rustling of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. Elijah stopped at a fruit vendor's stand and picked up a perfectly ripe peach, weighing it in his hand before placing it into a basket for purchase. He exchanged polite nods with the elderly vendor who, blissfully unaware of his guest's identity, asked for $3. Elijah paid with a smile and moved on, his basket now holding a small assortment of fruits and baked goods. The tranquility of the scene shattered abruptly. A sharp voice rang out over the market, cutting through the ambient chatter like a knife through silk. "Stop him! He stole it!" Elijah turned instinctively toward the commotion. A young woman, clutching her handbag, pointed an accusatory finger in his direction. Her face was flushed with indignation, and her eyes brimmed with tears of anger. Confused murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire. Before Elijah could register what was happening, 2 uniformed officers appeared, their presence announced by the clink of handcuffs and the crackle of radios. They approached him with hurried strides, their pale faces betraying a mixture of irritation and self-assurance. The taller of the 2, a man with a buzz cut and a prominent jawline, gestured sharply for Elijah to stop. "You, hands where I can see them," the officer barked, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Elijah raised his hand slowly, careful not to provoke the already tense situation. His calm demeanor seemed only to irritate the officers further. The shorter one, whose name tag read O'Connell, circled behind him, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "What's going on?" Elijah asked, his voice measured but his heart pounding. The taller officer sneered. "Don't play dumb. You were seen near the incident." "What incident?" Elijah pressed, though he already suspected the answer. The young woman approached, her face contorted with righteous fury. "My wallet! It was in my bag, and now it's gone. He was right next to me when I realized." Elijah opened his mouth to explain that he had just purchased fruit and hadn't even noticed her before now, but O'Connell didn't wait for his response. The cold metal of handcuffs snapped around Elijah's wrists and he was shoved toward a waiting police cruiser. "Hey, there's been a mistake," Elijah protested, though his voice remained calm. The officers ignored him. The ride to the station was a study in humiliation. The officers exchanged smug remarks, their disdain for Elijah thinly veiled. The taller one, who introduced himself as Officer McCarthy, made pointed comments about troublemakers wandering into decent towns. Elijah's attempts to explain his presence and purchases fell on deaf ears. He decided to remain silent. realizing his words were wasted on men who had already judged him. Upon arrival at the station, the humiliation deepened. Elijah was forced to empty his pockets while being watched by a small group of officers who snickered and whispered among themselves. His basket of fruit was unceremoniously dumped onto the floor, its contents spilling out like discarded refuse. One officer made a show of inspecting the items as though searching for contraband. Elijah stood quietly, observing the dynamics of the room. The officers spoke in loud, condescending tones, their words laced with assumptions and prejudice. It was clear they believed they had caught an outsider, someone who didn't belong and who needed to be put in his place. The paperwork that followed was a bureaucratic nightmare. Every question asked of Elijah was framed with suspicion. Every answer he gave met with incredulous smirks. When he requested a phone call, McCarthy laughed outright. "Phone call? What are you, a lawyer?" the officer quipped, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Elijah's lips tightened, but he said nothing. He was placed in a holding cell, the metal bars cold and unyielding beneath his hands as he gripped them. The cell smelled of disinfectant and despair, and the dim light overhead flickered intermittently. Hours passed. Elijah used the time to think, his mind racing through possible courses of action. He knew he could end this ordeal with a single phone call, a simple reveal of his identity, but something stopped him. He realized that what he was experiencing, this raw, unfiltered display of prejudice, was a glimpse into the world that so many others endured daily. It was a system he had worked to reform from the top down, yet here he was, seeing its mechanics in action on the ground level. By the time the officers came to escort him to his arraignment, the sun had set, casting long shadows through the narrow windows of the station. Elijah straightened his back and walked with steady steps, his hands still cuffed. He could hear the whispers of the officers behind him, their words mingling with the echoes of his footsteps. The courthouse loomed ahead, its facade weathered and imposing. As Elijah entered the building, he braced himself for what was to come. The courtroom was packed. Rows of wooden benches creaked under the weight of a crowd drawn by the promise of drama and spectacle. Whispers rippled through the room as Elijah Reeves was led in, his wrists bound, his expression unreadable. No one recognized him, and that anonymity allowed the onlookers to project their assumptions onto him. To them, he was just another outsider, an unfamiliar face in a town where everyone knew everyone. Elijah scanned the room as he was led to the defendant's table. The judge, a stern-faced man in his late 50s, sat at the bench with an air of impatience. His nameplate read, Judge Donald Harper. Elijah immediately noted Harper's posture and demeanor, rigid, formal, and subtly dismissive. The prosecutor, a wiry man named Henry Paxton, stood at his desk, shuffling through papers with an air of self-assured authority. A few uniformed officers, including McCarthy and O'Connell, hovered near the back, smirking as they exchanged low comments. The proceedings began with the formalities. The charges were read aloud: theft, resisting arrest, and disturbing the peace. Each word felt like a stone being stacked on a pile, designed to weigh Elijah down in the eyes of the court. When the prosecutor rose to make his opening statement, his voice dripped with performative outrage. "This case, Your Honor, is about accountability," Paxton began, pacing in front of the jury box. The defendant, a drifter with no ties to this community, brazenly stole from a young woman in broad daylight. When confronted by law enforcement, he resisted, causing a public disturbance. We cannot allow such behavior to go unpunished in our town. Elijah sat silently, his hands folded neatly on the table. He kept his gaze steady, focused on the judge. Paxton's words were designed to provoke emotion, to paint him as a threat to the community. But Elijah refused to rise to the bait. When it was the defense's turn to speak, the court-appointed attorney assigned to Elijah rose hesitantly. She was young, likely fresh out of law school, and her voice trembled as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, the defendant maintains his innocence and asks for the opportunity to present his side of the story." The judge nodded curtly, allowing the trial to proceed. Paxton wasted no time calling his first witnesses, the officers who had arrested Elijah. McCarthy took the stand first, his demeanor exuding arrogance. He recounted the events of the market with dramatic flair, embellishing details to paint Elijah as aggressive and uncooperative. O'Connell followed, echoing McCarthy's testimony almost verbatim. Elijah listened intently, noting every inconsistency in their accounts. McCarthy claimed Elijah had tried to flee, while O'Connell insisted he had stood defiantly, refusing to comply. Both accounts contradicted the basic facts of Elijah's arrest, and their rehearsed tone did little to mask the fabrication. The young attorney tried to cross-examine the officers, but her inexperience showed. Her questions lacked precision, and she struggled to challenge their assertions. The judge, clearly impatient, cut her off several times, admonishing her for wasting the court's time. Next, the young woman who had accused Elijah of theft took the stand. She described the incident with a mix of anger and confusion, emphasizing that she had felt threatened by Elijah's presence. Her testimony was laced with coded language, subtle but unmistakable. Words like suspicious and out of place hung heavy in the air, painting Elijah as an outsider whose mere existence was cause for alarm. When the prosecution rested its case, the judge called for a brief recess. Elijah remained seated as the crowd filed out, their whispers filling the room like a swarm of insects. He could feel their judgment pressing down on him, a weight he bore with quiet dignity. During the recess, Elijah's mind raced. He had seen enough to understand the depth of the problem. The trial was a farce, a performance designed to uphold a system that thrived on inequality. The prosecutor, the judge, the officers, each played their role, perpetuating a cycle of prejudice and injustice. Elijah's resolve hardened. He would not reveal his identity yet. There was still more to learn, more to expose. When court resumed, Elijah's attorney attempted to present a defense. She called a witness who had been at the market that day, a shopkeeper who vaguely remembered seeing Elijah near the fruit stand. The witness's testimony was neutral at best, failing to challenge the prosecution's narrative. The attorney then presented a receipt from Elijah's purchases, a flimsy piece of evidence that did little to sway the court. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Harper maintained an air of impatience. He frequently interrupted the defense, dismissing their arguments as irrelevant. Paxton, meanwhile, sat back with a satisfied smirk, confident that the outcome was already decided. By the time the defense rested, the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The judge announced that he would deliver his verdict the following day, and the crowd dispersed, leaving Elijah alone with his thoughts. Back in his holding cell that evening, Elijah reflected on the day's events. The trial was not about truth or justice, it was about power. Every step of the process had been designed to strip him of his dignity and humanity. But Elijah had spent his life fighting against systems like this one. He had seen injustice in all its forms, and he knew how to dismantle it. He sat on the cold metal bench, his mind working tirelessly. The evidence against him was weak, riddled with contradictions and biases. He knew he could reveal his identity at any moment, ending the charade and forcing the court to reckon with its failures. But timing was everything. If he acted too soon, the lessons would be lost. He needed to let the system expose itself fully before delivering the blow that would bring it to its knees. As the first rays of dawn crept through the narrow window of his cell, Elijah smiled to himself. He was ready for what came next. The courtroom was eerily silent the next morning as Elijah Reeves was led back to his seat at the defendant's table. The atmosphere was charged, as though the building itself anticipated the weight of what was about to transpire. The spectators returned, eager to witness the conclusion of the trial. Judge Harper entered the room, his expression as stony and inscrutable as the day before. His gavel struck the bench, calling the court to order. As the proceedings resumed, the prosecutor, Henry Paxton, rose with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He spoke with theatrical gravitas, reiterating the charges and emphasizing the so-called evidence presented the previous day. His words painted Elijah as a dangerous outsider, a disruption to the town's peace. Elijah sat motionless, his face calm, his hands folded neatly on the table. Judge Harper leaned forward, his fingers interlocked as he regarded Elijah. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his tone heavy with disdain, "before I deliver my verdict, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Elijah rose slowly, his tall frame commanding attention. He adjusted his cuffs, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. The audience shifted uneasily under the weight of his silent appraisal. For the first time since his arrest, Elijah's voice carried authority, slicing through the oppressive atmosphere like a blade. "Your Honor," he began, his tone measured and deliberate. "I do have something to say, but before I do, I would like to present evidence that has not yet been brought to light." A ripple of confusion spread through the room. Judge Harper frowned, clearly irritated. "This is highly irregular," he snapped. "You've had your chance to present evidence." "Respectfully, Your Honor," Elijah replied, his voice steady, "I request that you hear me out. What I'm about to reveal is of great importance not only to this case, but to the integrity of this court." Harper hesitated, then gestured impatiently. "You may proceed." Elijah reached into his pocket, extracting a small leather case. He opened it, revealing the golden emblem of the Supreme Court of the United States. The courtroom gasped in unison. Even Judge Harper seemed momentarily stunned. Elijah placed the badge on the table in front of him, letting its significance sink in. "My name is Elijah Reeves," he said, his voice firm. "I am a justice of the Supreme Court. For the past 48 hours, I have observed the workings of this court and its officers. What I have witnessed is a disturbing display of systemic bias, corruption, and abuse of power." The room erupted into chaos. Spectators whispered furiously while Paxton rose, his face pale. "This is preposterous," he sputtered. "You can't expect us to believe—" Elijah cut him off with a sharp glance. "You'll find my credentials in the case before you. If you wish, you may contact federal authorities for confirmation. They have already been informed of these proceedings." Judge Harper's face darkened as he reviewed the badge. The tension in the room was palpable as the truth began to unravel. Elijah continued, his voice rising with conviction. "From the moment I arrived in this town, I have been treated not as a human being, but as a stereotype. I was accused without evidence, detained without due process, and subjected to humiliation by officers sworn to uphold the law. This trial has been nothing more than a farce, designed to reinforce the biases that pervade this system." He gestured toward the officers in the back of the room. These men fabricated evidence and lied under oath. The prosecutor built a case on their deceit, and this court has allowed it to proceed unchecked. This is not justice. It is a mockery of it." Paxton attempted to interject, but Judge Harper raised a hand to silence him. The judge's expression was unreadable as he turned his attention back to Elijah. "Do you have evidence to support these claims?" Harper asked, his voice laced with tension. "I do," Elijah replied. He opened a folder containing documents he had prepared the previous night. These records show discrepancies in the officers' testimonies, as well as prior complaints filed against them for misconduct. I also have video footage from the market that clearly shows I never approached the alleged victim's bag. A bailiff stepped forward to collect the folder, handing it to the judge. Harper reviewed the documents, his frown deepening with every page. The room was silent except for the rustle of paper. After several agonizing minutes, the judge looked up. His voice was strained. "This court will take a brief recess to review this new evidence." The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted into a frenzy of whispers. Elijah remained seated, his demeanor calm. He watched as the officers exchanged nervous glances, their smug confidence evaporating. Paxton paced furiously, his earlier composure shattered. When the court reconvened, Judge Harper's expression was grim. "The evidence presented by Mr. Reeves is compelling and raises serious concerns about the conduct of this court and its officers. Effective immediately, all charges against Mr. Reeves are dismissed. Furthermore, this court will refer this case to federal authorities for investigation." The spectators erupted into murmurs. Elijah stood, his tall frame radiating quiet authority. As he turned to leave, he paused, addressing the room one final time. Justice is not just a principle. It is a responsibility. It demands accountability from those who wield power. What happened here today is a reminder that we must remain vigilant in defending it. With that, he strode out of the courtroom, leaving behind a stunned and chastened audience. The officers and prosecutor avoided his gaze, their earlier bravado replaced by palpable fear. The gavel fell one final time, signaling the end of the trial. As Elijah stepped into the sunlight, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The battle was not over, but a victory had been won. And as the town began to reckon with the truth, Elijah knew that his work had only just begun. The days that followed Elijah Reeves's dramatic revelation sent shockwaves through the town and beyond. The quiet provincial community was suddenly thrust into the national spotlight, its dirty secrets laid bare for all to see. News outlets from across the country descended on the courthouse, eager to cover the unfolding scandal. Elijah's name, now synonymous with justice and courage, dominated headlines. Yet, for all the noise outside, the work inside the courthouse was far from over. The federal investigation Elijah had initiated moved swiftly. Armed with the evidence he had provided, agents from the Department of Justice began scrutinizing the conduct of the local police force, the prosecutor's office, and even the judiciary. The investigation uncovered a web of systemic abuses, falsified reports, coerced confessions, and a pattern of targeting marginalized individuals under the guise of law enforcement. The first to face justice were the officers who had arrested Elijah. McCarthy and O'Connell were brought before the court, this time as defendants. Their smugness had evaporated, replaced by a nervous tension as they stood before the same judge who had once supported their actions. The evidence against them was damning. Recorded instances of fabricated evidence, racist comments captured on body cameras, and testimonies from other victims who had come forward in the wake of Elijah's trial. The court found them guilty of multiple counts of misconduct, abuse of power, and perjury. Their sentences were not lenient. They were stripped of their badges and sentenced to prison terms, their reputations in ruins. As they were led away in handcuffs, the symbolism was not lost on the spectators who had gathered to watch the proceedings. Prosecutor Henry Paxton was next. The investigation revealed that Paxton had a long history of pursuing cases with little regard for evidence or fairness, often relying on the testimony of officers like McCarthy and O'Connell to secure convictions. His aggressive tactics and pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals were exposed in excruciating detail. Paxton, once a pillar of the community, now faced disciplinary hearings that would determine his future in law. The State Bar Association ultimately revoked his license to practice, and he resigned in disgrace. Judge Harper, too, was not spared scrutiny. His conduct during Elijah's trial and his history of dismissing complaints of bias were brought under review. While he avoided criminal charges, the Judicial Oversight Board found him guilty of ethical violations. He was forced into early retirement, his career ending in ignominy. As the investigations wrapped up, Elijah turned his attention to the future. He recognized that punishing the guilty was only the first step. The town needed systemic reforms to ensure that such abuses could never happen again. To that end, he brought together a team of legal experts, civil rights advocates, and community leaders. Together, they drafted a series of proposals aimed at overhauling the local justice system. The reforms included mandatory bias training for law enforcement, the establishment of an independent review board to investigate complaints against officers, and stricter oversight of prosecutorial conduct. Elijah also advocated for increased community engagement, encouraging dialogue between residents and law enforcement to rebuild trust. The reforms were met with resistance from some quarters, particularly from those who had long benefited from the status quo. Yet Elijah's presence and the undeniable weight of the evidence he had exposed made it difficult for detractors to dismiss the changes outright. The town council voted to implement the reforms, marking a new chapter in the community's history. Meanwhile, Elijah continued to receive letters and messages from people across the country. Many shared stories of their own encounters with injustice, thanking him for using his platform to shine a light on these issues. Elijah responded to as many as he could, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. Despite the attention and accolades, Elijah remained grounded. He knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, and his experience in the town had only strengthened his resolve. He stayed long enough to ensure the reforms were firmly in place before quietly packing his bags and returning to his life in the capital. On his last day in the town, Elijah took a walk through the marketplace where the ordeal had begun. The same fruit vendor greeted him warmly, offering a basket of fresh peaches as a gesture of gratitude. Elijah accepted with a smile, his thoughts returning to the lessons he had learned during his time here. As he boarded the train that would take him back to the capital, Elijah looked out at the town one last time. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape. It was a town forever changed, its people awakened to the power of accountability and the importance of justice. Elijah leaned back in his seat, the hum of the train a comforting backdrop to his thoughts. He knew there would be other battles to fight, other systems to challenge. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had prevailed here, and he had no doubt it would again. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes, and don't forget to turn on notifications. If you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends. Maybe it will inspire them too. And while you're here, check out our other videos. I'm sure you'll find them interesting too. See you in the next issue.